There's a moment in history, one of those moments where you read something and have to put the book down and just sit with it for a while. This is one of those stories. Picture a respectable physician's office. London, maybe, or New York. The year is 1885, mahogany furniture, medical diplomas on the wall, the smell of carbolic soap and leather-bound medical texts. A woman sits in the waiting room, gloved hands folded in her lap, waiting to see the doctor about her condition. She's anxious, irritable, can't sleep properly, feels a heaviness she can't quite name. The doctor will see her shortly. He'll perform a treatment, a medical procedure, documented in journals. Welcome back to another journey into history's hidden truths. Get comfy, maybe dim the lights, and let's explore something that will change how you see medieval romance forever. Before we begin, hit subscribe if you enjoy these nighttime stories, and drop a comment letting me know where you're listening from and what time it is there. I love hearing from you. Tonight we're traveling to medieval Europe, where love was a game with very specific rules. He'll manually stimulate her genitals until she experiences what Victorian medicine called hysterical paroxysm, what we call orgasm. This wasn't scandal. This wasn't the medical fringe. This was mainstream practice, performed by respected physicians on respectable women, sometimes multiple times a week for decades. And the truly strange part? Everyone involved genuinely believed it was medicine. Welcome to another night of uncomfortable truths. I'm glad you're here, settling in as the day winds down, ready to explore one of the most bizarre intersections of medicine, morality, and human need in recorded history. Tonight, we're entering the examining rooms of Victorian England and America, roughly 1850 to 1920, a period when scientific advancement and sexual repression created something almost unbelievable, an entire medical apparatus built around a simple reality no one could acknowledge: women have sexual needs. The diagnosis was hysteria, the treatment was orgasm, and thousands of women received this treatment from their doctors while everyone involved performed mental gymnastics to avoid calling it what it was. This story reveals something profound about how humans construct systems to address needs they refuse to admit exist, how ideology can override obvious reality, how entire professions can participate in something and genuinely not see it for what it is. So settle in, get comfortable. What follows is strange and uncomfortable, and absolutely documentably true. Victorian society, and we're talking roughly 1837 to 1901 in Britain, with similar attitudes in America through the 1920s, operated under sexual rules, so rigid, so comprehensive, that they bordered on the absurd. For men, the rules acknowledged reality, at least partially. Men were understood to have powerful sexual drives requiring regular release. This was considered natural, biological, even healthy. The mechanisms for this release, marriage, mistresses, prostitution, existed in a moral grey area, but the need itself was accepted. Men's sexuality was a force to be managed, channeled, controlled, but it was real. For women, particularly middle and upper-class women, the official position was different. Respectable women were pure, passionless. They tolerated marital relations as a duty, endured it for procreation, but they didn't desire it, couldn't desire it. Female sexual desire in a respectable woman was impossible, a contradiction, like a square circle. Medical texts from the 1850s state this explicitly. Dr. William Acton, a prominent British physician, wrote in 1857 that the majority of women, happily for them, are not very much troubled with sexual feeling of any kind. He considered this a blessing, a sign of refinement and moral development. Books on marriage advised men to approach their wives with consideration for their delicate, non-sexual nature. Conduct literature for young ladies emphasized purity, modesty, and the complete absence of carnal thought. The ideal Victorian woman was an angel, spiritual, refined, above such base concerns as physical desire. Except, of course, women are human beings with bodies and needs just like men. When women exhibited certain symptoms, anxiety, irritability, insomnia, fluid retention, abdominal heaviness, muscle spasms, shortness of breath, loss of appetite, or what doctors delicately termed excessive sexual desire, Victorian medicine had a diagnosis ready: hysteria. The word comes from the Greek hystera, meaning uterus. The diagnosis had ancient roots. Hippocrates, writing in the 4th century BCE, described hysteria as a condition caused by the womb wandering through the body seeking moisture. The cure, logically enough, was marriage and pregnancy, which would anchor the womb in place and provide it the fluids it sought. By Victorian times, doctors had abandoned the wandering womb theory. They weren't that primitive, but they kept the diagnosis. now attributing it to disorders of the female reproductive system and what they called nervous constitution. Medical estimates from the 1860s suggested that 75% of women would suffer from hysteria at some point in their lives. 75%, 3 out of 4 women. Medical textbooks from this period describe hysteria as the most common ailment in medical practice. Physicians built entire careers treating it. Think about that for a moment. Either Victorian women were genuinely diseased en masse, or something else was happening. The symptoms were real enough. Women were anxious, frustrated, unable to sleep. They felt physical tension they couldn't name or relieve. They were irritable with their husbands, restless, seeking something they couldn't articulate because they'd been taught their entire lives that respectable women didn't want that. So they went to their doctors. The standard medical treatment for hysteria was pelvic massage. The physician, usually male, always respectable, trained at proper medical schools, would have the patient recline on an examining table. Her skirts would be arranged for modesty, covering her upper body and legs while leaving the pelvic area accessible. The doctor would apply oil to his fingers, and then he would manually stimulate her genitals, focusing on the clitoris and vaginal opening, until she experienced what medical journals termed hysterical paroxysm. The paroxysm was characterized by rapid breathing, flushed skin, involuntary muscular contractions, vocalizations, and a sense of profound relief. We call this an orgasm. They called it a therapeutic crisis, a release of nervous tension, a correction of uterine disorder. Medical journals from the 1870s describe the procedure in perfectly clinical language. Dr. Russell Thacker Trull's medical texts from 1866 note that pelvic massage successfully relieves symptoms in the majority of hysteria cases. He recommends the technique be performed until the characteristic crisis is achieved, which provides marked relief. The Lancet, one of the most respected medical journals, published discussions of hysteria treatment that obliquely reference this practice. Physicians debated proper technique, duration, and frequency. Some recommended weekly treatments. Others suggested twice weekly for severe cases. One medical text from 1879 notes that the procedure should be performed with clinical detachment, and that the physician must maintain absolute professionalism despite the patient's involuntary responses. The language is telling. The patient's responses are involuntary, not something she's seeking or enjoying, just something that happens to her body during necessary medical treatment. The doctors genuinely thought this was medicine, not sex. The reasoning went like this. Respectable women were incapable of sexual feeling. This was established medical fact. Therefore, the physical response couldn't be sexual in nature. It must be something else. A release of nervous energy, a correction of humoral imbalance, a therapeutic crisis that restored proper function to the reproductive system. The fact that it looked exactly like sexual climax, produced the same physical responses, and left the patient feeling exactly the way sexually satisfied people feel, well, that was coincidence. Similarity of symptom, not similarity of cause. The women, for their part, could receive what they needed while maintaining their identity as pure, passionless ladies. They weren't seeking sexual gratification that would be unthinkable. They were receiving medical treatment for a legitimate ailment. The relief they felt was therapeutic, not sensual. This shared delusion between doctor and patient allowed both parties to address a very real need while preserving the ideological fiction that respectable women didn't have such needs. It's almost beautiful in its absurdity. Almost. The practice was also incredibly lucrative. A single treatment could take anywhere from 30 minutes to over an hour. The physician had to work slowly, carefully, reading the patient's responses, adjusting pressure and rhythm until the therapeutic crisis was achieved. Some patients responded quickly, others required extended sessions, and women came back. Weekly appointments were common, twice weekly for those who could afford it. Some women saw their physicians for hysteria treatment for years. Picture a successful physician's practice in 1880s London. The morning is full of standard complaints, fevers, digestive issues, respiratory ailments. But the afternoon schedule shows something different. Mrs. Pemberton at 2 o'clock. Miss Hartwell at 3, Mrs. Ashford at 4:15, all listed in the appointment book as hysteria treatment. The waiting room fills with respectable women. They make small talk, perhaps about the weather or charitable work, carefully not discussing why they're really there. They wait their turn. They receive their treatment. They leave feeling calmer, more relaxed, better able to face their duties as wives and daughters. And the doctor is exhausted. Medical journals from the 1880s include discussions among physicians about the physical demands of hysteria treatment: hand cramping, wrist pain, repetitive strain injuries. One physician writes in 1886 about developing chronic tendinitis from performing pelvic massage. Another notes that his practice includes so many hysteria cases that his right hand is frequently fatigued to the point of trembling. Doctors were treating so many women so frequently that repetitive strain injury became an occupational hazard. The demand was enormous. The need was real. The treatment worked, in the sense that it relieved the symptoms women were experiencing, but the doctors' hands were giving out. They needed a technological solution. The vibrator was invented to solve a medical problem: how to give large numbers of women orgasms more efficiently. I want you to sit with that for a moment. In 1869, an American physician named George Taylor patented a device called the manipulator. It was a steam-powered vibrating apparatus designed specifically for treating female hysteria. The patient would lie on a padded table. A vibrating mechanism powered by a steam engine in an adjacent room would be applied to the pelvic region through various interchangeable applicators. The device was enormous. Installing it required dedicating a room in the medical office to the steam engine. It was expensive. Only the most successful physicians could afford one. But it worked. What took a doctor 45 minutes to accomplish manually could be achieved in 10 minutes with the manipulator. Medical journals reviewed it favorably. The steam-powered vibrator was faster, more consistent, and didn't tire. It was progress. In 1883, Dr. Joseph Mortimer Granville took it further. He invented a portable electromechanical vibrator, the Granville hammer, powered by batteries. Now physicians could perform hysteria treatments without needing steam engines or permanent installations. Granville was careful in how he marketed his invention. He published medical papers emphasizing that the vibrator was for treating various ailments, nervous disorders, muscular complaints, even digestive issues. But he made sure doctors understood its primary application. The device sold. Within a few years, other manufacturers entered the market. By the 1890s, over a dozen companies produced medical vibrators. They advertised in medical journals. They set up displays at medical conferences. Physicians who specialized in women's health considered them essential equipment. In 1899, the first home vibrator appeared in consumer catalogs. Now women could purchase their own devices for treating hysteria in the privacy of their homes. No need for weekly doctor visits. No need to undress in a medical office. Just a simple appliance for personal health maintenance. The Sears Roebuck catalogue for 1918. You can find this in archives. It's documented, featured a full-page advertisement for home vibrators. The ad copy is remarkable. Vibration is life, it proclaims. It will chase away the years like magic. The advertisement shows a woman using the device on her face and neck. Respectable applications. But the text makes the real purpose clear. It mentions treatment for nervous exhaustion, poor circulation, and being run down and weak. It promises to provide thrilling, invigorating, penetrating, revitalizing vibration, all for the very reasonable price of $5.75. Thousands sold. Victorian women bought vibrators the way we buy heating pads or massage tools. They were health devices, wellness products, completely proper and medicinal. The pretense continued right into people's homes. Direct accounts from Victorian women about this treatment are rare. Respectable ladies didn't write detailed descriptions of medical procedures involving their genitals. The very act would have been scandalous, even in private diaries. But occasionally, carefully worded references appear. A diary entry from 1886, discovered in archives years later, notes weekly visits to a physician for relief of nervous tension that leaves the writer feeling wonderfully calm and restored. She mentions that the treatment is somewhat embarrassing but entirely proper, and that her doctor is most professional and clinical in his manner. Reading between the lines is almost painfully easy. A letter from 1892, one woman to another, recommends a particular doctor in Boston. He has the most modern equipment, she writes, and his treatments are remarkably effective for the feminine constitution. I cannot overstate the benefit I have derived. She includes his address and suggests her friend make an appointment for an initial consultation. Another woman's correspondence from 1898 mentions purchasing a health apparatus from a catalogue and finding it quite as effective as the doctor's office, though one must learn proper application through careful experimentation. The euphemisms are transparent now. They probably were then too. On some level, these women couldn't quite acknowledge. These women weren't stupid. They weren't naive. On some level, they knew what was happening. But the ideology was so powerful, the social construction of female passionless so complete, that they couldn't admit it even to themselves. They needed relief. Victorian morality said they couldn't need what they actually needed, so they convinced themselves it was medicine. The alternative, acknowledging sexual desire, would have meant seeing themselves as fallen, unrespectable, ruined. It would have meant psychological crisis, social shame, possibly even religious guilt severe enough to break them. Better to believe in hysteria. Better to believe the treatment was therapeutic. The lie was kinder than the truth. By the 1890s, a new generation of physicians, influenced by developments in psychology and psychiatry, began raising concerns. Sigmund Freud's work on hysteria, published throughout the 1890s and early 1900s, proposed that hysteria had psychological rather than physiological origins. Freud suggested it stemmed from repressed trauma, internal conflict, and yes, sexual frustration. But he argued the solution was psychoanalysis, not physical treatment. Freud himself had studied with Jean-Martin Charcot in Paris, watching Charcot demonstrate hysteria in patients at the Salpêtrière Hospital. Freud came away convinced that hysteria was real, but fundamentally misunderstood. The symptoms were physical manifestations of psychological distress. This was revolutionary thinking. It suggested that you couldn't cure hysteria with genital massage because hysteria wasn't caused by uterine malfunction. The massage might relieve symptoms temporarily. Freud wasn't disputing that, but it didn't address underlying causes. Other physicians, particularly younger doctors trained in more modern approaches, began making an even more obvious observation. The symptoms of hysteria matched sexual frustration. The treatment produced orgasm. The relief patients experienced was identical to post-coital satisfaction. Maybe, just maybe, respectable women had sexual needs after all. But saying this publicly, in Victorian society, was professional suicide. You might as well have stood up at a medical conference and announced that you'd discovered the earth was flat. The entire social order rested on the premise of female passionlessness. Challenging it meant challenging everything. So the skeptics wrote carefully worded papers about psychological factors in hysteria. They suggested alternative treatments, talk therapy, rest cures, changes in domestic circumstances. They quietly reduced their own use of pelvic massage, but they couldn't stop the practice. Not yet. Too many physicians relied on it. Too many women sought it. The economic incentives were too strong, and the ideological commitment too deep. The fiction would have to collapse on its own. And it did collapse, though not for the reasons you might expect. The decline of hysteria treatment didn't come from medical enlightenment or social progress. It came from pornography. As vibrators became widely available for home use in the 1900s and 1910s, they started appearing in contexts that were less medical. Erotic photographers began featuring them. Underground sexual literature mentioned them. Women's private conversations about vibrators became less euphemistic. And then, in the 1920s, vibrators appeared in stag films. Stag films were early pornographic movies, illegal to produce or distribute, shown at private gatherings of men. They were explicit, unambiguous, sexual, and they featured vibrators being used exactly the way Victorian women had been using them all along, for sexual pleasure. Once that connection became explicit and public, doctors could no longer maintain the fiction. You couldn't argue that a device was purely medical when it was appearing in pornography. You couldn't claim female sexual response was purely therapeutic when films were showing women clearly enjoying it for its own sake. The pretense finally became unsustainable. Through the 1920s and 1930s, physicians quietly stopped offering pelvic massage for hysteria. Medical schools stopped teaching it. The diagnosis of hysteria itself began to fragment. Anxiety disorder, depression, sexual dysfunction, psychosomatic illness. Doctors started acknowledging, at least privately, that many hysteria cases had been simple sexual frustration. The vibrator industry pivoted. Devices marketed as medical tools became harder to find. Instead, vibrators were rebranded as massage devices for sore muscles, with carefully non-specific advertising that avoided any mention of women's health. In 1952, the American Psychiatric Association officially removed hysteria from the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. The diagnosis that had been medicine's most common ailment for a century simply disappeared. Except, of course, it didn't really disappear. It transformed. The underlying assumptions that women's sexuality is complicated, problematic, requiring medical or expert intervention, those persisted. They persist still. By the 1950s, everyone knew about female orgasm. The Kinsey reports, published in 1948 and 1953, documented sexual behavior in explicit detail. Women had orgasms. They enjoyed sex. This was now established scientific fact. But watch what happened to this knowledge. The medical establishment, having spent decades treating female sexual response as a disease symptom, now decided it needed expert management. Sexology emerged as a field. Marriage manuals proliferated, written by male doctors. The female orgasm became something to be achieved. a marker of marital success, a problem to be solved. Women who didn't orgasm during intercourse were labeled frigid, a diagnosis almost as pathologizing as hysteria. Women who wanted sex too much were nymphomaniacs. Women's sexuality was still abnormal by definition, just in different ways. The 1960s brought the sexual revolution, which should have changed everything. But pay attention to how female sexuality was discussed. Women were now free to enjoy sex, but only the right kind. Orgasm from penetration was mature and healthy. Orgasm from clitoral stimulation was immature, a sign of psychological issues. Freud had declared this decades earlier, and it became accepted wisdom. The vibrator, meanwhile, continued its strange journey through American culture. By the 1970s, feminist sex shops like Eve's Garden in New York began openly selling vibrators as tools for female sexual pleasure. No medical pretense, no therapeutic justification, just honest acknowledgement of what they'd always been. This was radical at the time, revolutionary. The idea that women could purchase devices solely for their own sexual pleasure, without medical or male mediation, challenged fundamental assumptions. Even today, the legacy continues. Walk into any pharmacy. Vibrators are in the personal health aisle, often still marketed with euphemistic language about personal massages and wellness. The packaging shows women using them on their shoulders and backs. Everyone knows what they're really for, but the fiction persists. Softer than the Victorian version but still present. Sex therapy exists as a medical specialty. Sexual dysfunction is still pathologized. Women still receive medical interventions for sexual concerns that might simply be the result of bad relationships. We've made progress, certainly. But the fundamental pattern, women's sexuality as medical problem requiring expert intervention, that pattern Victorian doctors established, is still visible if you know where to look. Now back to 1885. The woman waiting is, let's say, named Catherine. She's 32 years old, married for 12 years, 3 children. Her husband is a banker, respectable, good provider. They have a nice house, servants, a comfortable life. Catherine hasn't slept well in months. She feels anxious for reasons she can't explain. There's a tension in her body, a restlessness. She's irritable with her husband, short-tempered with the children. She feels guilty about these feelings. A good wife and mother shouldn't be so dissatisfied. Her husband suggested she see Dr. Waverley. He's very good with women's complaints, he said. Mrs. Patterson sees him regularly and says he's worked wonders. So Catherine made an appointment. She's sitting in the waiting room now, looking at the wallpaper, the botanical prints on the walls. Another woman sits across from her, maybe 40 years old, reading a ladies' magazine. They don't speak. What would they say? A nurse appears. Mrs. Ashford, the doctor will see you now. Catherine follows her to the examination room. It's clean, professional, an examination table with a leather surface, a small table with medical instruments, a sink, everything proper and medical. Dr. Waverley enters. He's perhaps 50, grey-haired, professional manner. Mrs. Ashford, good afternoon. Please have a seat. Tell me what brings you here today. Catherine describes her symptoms, the anxiety, the restlessness, the difficulty sleeping. She's careful to be delicate in her language. These are private matters, difficult to discuss with a man, even a doctor. Dr. Waverley nods knowingly. I see. These are classic symptoms of hysteria, I'm afraid. A very common complaint among ladies of your class and station. The condition stems from disturbances in the uterine system, combined with nervous sensitivity. Fortunately, there is an effective treatment. He explains the procedure. Catherine will need to recline on the examination table. The nurse will be present to maintain propriety. Dr. Waverley will perform a pelvic massage to relieve the uterine congestion and nervous tension. The treatment will cause a therapeutic crisis, physical responses that may seem dramatic but are entirely normal and beneficial. Catherine feels embarrassed but also relieved. It's a medical condition. There's a treatment. The doctor is professional and clinical. She agrees. What happens next is documented in medical literature but rarely discussed in detail. The nurse helps Catherine onto the table, arranges her clothing for modesty. Dr. Waverley washes his hands thoroughly. Victorian doctors were very concerned about antiseptic practice. He applies oil to his fingers, and then he begins the treatment. Medical texts describe the proper technique, gentle circular motions, attention to areas of sensitivity, gradual increase in pressure and tempo. The physician must watch the patient's responses, breathing rate, flush of skin, muscular tension. The treatment continues until the hysterical paroxysm is achieved. For Catherine, the experience is confusing. The physical sensations are She has no words for them. She's never felt anything like this, or at least never acknowledged feeling it. Her breathing quickens. Her body responds in ways she doesn't control. She feels tension building towards some unknown crisis. And then, release. Waves of sensation. Involuntary sounds she can't quite suppress. The nurse looks away, tactful. Dr. Waverley maintains his clinical expression, though he must be very familiar with this response by now. Afterward, Catherine feels strange, relaxed, calm. The anxiety that's plagued her for months feels distant, manageable. Her body feels different somehow. Settled. Dr. Waverley washes his hands again. The treatment was successful, he says. You should feel significant relief from your symptoms. I recommend weekly treatments for the next month. Then we'll assess whether continued care is needed. Catherine nods. She's still catching her breath. She schedules her next appointment on the way out. Catherine will return the following week, and the week after that, she'll become a regular patient, seeing Dr. Waverley for years. Her husband will consider the medical bills money well spent. His wife is calmer, more pleasant, easier to live with. Catherine herself will never quite think about what's really happening. To think about it clearly would be to acknowledge things she cannot acknowledge. So she'll maintain the fiction, medical treatment, hysteria, therapeutic crisis, and she'll feel better. That's not fiction. The relief is real. But consider what this meant for her life. She's married to a man who doesn't provide sexual satisfaction. Victorian men were often taught that vigorous sexual activity was dangerous for their wives, that they should be quick and considerate, minimize the experience. The idea of focusing on female pleasure would have been foreign, possibly shocking. So Catherine's actual sexual needs went unmet in her marriage. But she couldn't acknowledge having those needs, couldn't ask for what she wanted, couldn't even consciously know what she wanted. Instead, she developed symptoms, and the symptoms led her to treatment. And the treatment gave her what she needed while allowing her to believe she wasn't getting what she couldn't want. It's tragic, really, and brilliant, and completely insane. Doctors didn't think they were giving women orgasms. They genuinely believed they were inducing a therapeutic crisis in a diseased organ system. The reasoning was supported by medical theory of the time. Victorian medicine understood the body through the lens of nervous energy and vital force. Health meant proper distribution of this energy throughout the body's systems. Illness resulted from blockages, congestion, or misdirection of vital force. The female reproductive system, doctors believed, was particularly susceptible to these disturbances. The uterus and ovaries required regular stimulation to maintain healthy function, much as the digestive system needed food or the lungs needed air. In married women, this stimulation supposedly came from intercourse and pregnancy. But even in marriage, doctors theorized the stimulation might be insufficient. In unmarried women, the problem was more severe. Without the regular stimulation of married life, the reproductive organs became congested with vital energy. This congestion led to the symptoms of hysteria, nervous tension, anxiety, physical discomfort. The cure, logically, was to provide the missing stimulation. Pelvic massage, in this theoretical construct, wasn't sexual. It was therapeutic manipulation of organs, similar to massaging a cramped muscle or manipulating a dislocated joint. The paroxysm was the moment when congested energy released, allowing the organs to return to normal function. The fact that this looked exactly like sexual climax was coincidental. Superficial similarity didn't mean functional equivalence. Medical journals published papers reinforcing this interpretation. Articles discussed proper technique for achieving therapeutic paroxysm. They debated whether the treatment should focus more on external or internal stimulation. They examined which patients responded best to which approaches, and nobody, at least not in print, said the obvious: these are orgasms. To be fair to Victorian doctors, there was legitimate medical confusion about female anatomy and response. The clitoris had been described anatomically since the Renaissance, but its function was debated. Some anatomists correctly identified it as an organ of sexual pleasure. Others thought it was vestigial, serving no real purpose. Medical education often skipped over it entirely as unimportant. The female orgasm itself was poorly understood. Some doctors believed women didn't have orgasms at all. Others thought they did, but that orgasm was unnecessary for conception, and therefore medically irrelevant. The idea that female sexual response might be important for women's own well-being was rarely considered. So when doctors observed that pelvic massage produced dramatic physical responses that relieved symptoms, they genuinely didn't have a clear construct for understanding what was happening. The sexual interpretation was available, but it contradicted core social beliefs. The medical interpretation fit better with Victorian ideology. They chose the interpretation that allowed them to maintain their worldview. When evidence contradicts belief, humans are remarkably creative at reinterpreting the evidence. The women experienced the same mental conflict and resolved it the same way. The alternative, acknowledging that they were receiving sexual services from their doctors, that they were seeking and enjoying these services, that they had sexual needs independent of their husbands, was psychologically impossible. Better to believe in mysterious uterine congestion and therapeutic paroxysms. Better to frame pleasure as medical necessity. Hysteria treatment wasn't cheap. A single session might cost anywhere from $2 to $5 in the 1880s and 1890s. That doesn't sound like much until you adjust for inflation. We're talking about $50 to over $100 in today's money, per session. And women came weekly, sometimes twice weekly, for months or years. Dr. Waverley, our hypothetical physician, might see 6 to 8 hysteria patients per day, 5 days a week. At $3 per session, that's $90 to $120 per week from hysteria treatment alone, perhaps $2,500 weekly in modern terms. Multiply that across thousands of physicians in major cities. The economic scale of hysteria treatment was massive, and it was concentrated among the wealthy. Working-class women couldn't afford regular doctor visits for hysteria. They had actual survival concerns occupying their attention. Hysteria was predominantly a middle and upper-class diagnosis, which tells you something right there. Women with leisure time, trapped in restrictive social roles, married to men who'd been taught that female sexual pleasure was unnecessary or even harmful. These were the women who developed hysteria. These were the women who could pay for weekly treatments. The class dynamics are impossible to ignore. Wealthy women paid male doctors to give them orgasms while everyone pretended it was medicine. Poor women, well, they had other problems. Some doctors built entire practices around women's nervous disorders. They developed reputations as specialists. They invested in the latest equipment, the vibrators, the electrical devices, the hydrotherapy equipment that was also used for hysteria treatment. Yes, hydrotherapy. That's another aspect of this story. Victorian medical establishments offered water cure treatments for hysteria. Women would visit spas where powerful jets of water would be directed at the pelvic region. The theory, again, was that this provided therapeutic stimulation to the uterine system. The reality, high-pressure water directed at the genitals produces the same result as manual massage, just with different equipment. Some hydrotherapy spas became notorious for their hysteria treatments. Women would spend weeks at these establishments receiving daily water cure sessions. The spas marketed themselves as respectable health retreats. Society ladies would plan their social calendars around visits to Bath or Saratoga Springs or the German spa towns. And while they were there, they received treatment that amounted to mechanically assisted masturbation. The lengths Victorian society went to in order to facilitate sexual release while denying that's what was happening, it's almost impressive. Dr. Joseph Mortimer Granville, who invented the portable vibrator, actually opposed using his device for hysteria treatment. In his writings, he insisted that the Granville hammer was intended for treating muscular and nervous conditions in both men and women, not specifically for pelvic massage in female patients. He lost that battle immediately. Doctors bought his vibrators and used them exactly for hysteria treatment. The market wanted them for that purpose. Granville's protests were noted and ignored. Other physicians expressed unease in more subtle ways. Some medical texts from the 1890s discuss hysteria treatment with careful language that suggests the authors were aware of certain implications. One doctor writes in 1897 about the importance of maintaining absolute clinical detachment during hysteria treatment, and warns that physicians must guard against any personal response to the patient's crisis, which would be most unprofessional. Reading this now, you can see him grappling with something he can't quite articulate. He knows there's something problematic about the treatment. He can sense the boundary being crossed, but he can't name it without admitting what's really happening. So he couches it in terms of professional standards. Clinical detachment, appropriate boundaries, never acknowledging that the boundary in question is between medicine and sex. Some doctors went further. They argued that hysteria treatment should be performed by midwives or female nurses rather than male physicians. This suggestion appeared periodically in medical journals starting in the 1870s. The reasoning was practical. Women would be more comfortable with female practitioners, and the procedure was relatively simple, not requiring a physician's specialized training. The real subtext, barely hidden, was that there was something inappropriate about male doctors performing this procedure on female patients. But this suggestion never gained traction. Male physicians weren't about to give up a lucrative part of their practice, and respectable women generally preferred male doctors who had proper medical education over midwives who were often working class and less educated. Plus, acknowledging that the procedure was inappropriate for male doctors to perform would mean acknowledging why it was inappropriate, which would mean admitting what it actually was. So male physicians continued the practice. 3 years later, Catherine has settled into a routine. It's 1888 now. She's been seeing Dr. Waverley regularly. The visits have become part of her routine, as ordinary as her weekly charitable work or her Tuesday afternoon teas. She doesn't think about the treatments much anymore. They're just something she does for her health, like taking a tonic or getting fresh air. The initial embarrassment has faded. Dr. Waverley is professional. The procedure is quick and efficient. Now that he knows her responses, she feels better. That's what matters. The anxiety that plagued her in 1885 is manageable now. She sleeps better. She's more patient with her husband and children. Life is acceptable. Her husband approves of the treatments. Dr. Waverley has done wonders for your constitution, he says. He doesn't ask for details. That would be indelicate. He just knows his wife is healthier and happier, and he's willing to pay for that. Catherine's friends also see Dr. Waverley. They don't discuss it explicitly, but there's a shared understanding. When someone mentions nervous troubles, someone else might quietly recommend Dr. Waverley. He's very good with women's complaints. A network exists. An underground of respectable women sharing information. It's all very proper, very medical, very appropriate. And absolutely everyone involved knows, on some level, they refuse to examine what's really happening. Consider what Catherine would have to confront if she acknowledged the truth. She would have to admit that she has sexual needs independent of procreation. These needs aren't being met in her marriage. She's paying another man to satisfy them. She's been doing this for years. She enjoys it. In Victorian society, this admission would destroy her. Not just socially, psychologically. Her entire self-concept is built on being a virtuous, passionless wife and mother. Sexual desire would make her fallen, corrupt, unwomanly. The hysteria construct protects her from this. She's not a sexual being seeking gratification. She's a patient receiving treatment for a medical condition. The pleasure she experiences isn't pleasure, it's therapeutic relief from nervous tension. The alternative narrative is available. She could see it if she looked, but looking would mean psychological annihilation. So she doesn't look. None of them look. And doctors, for their part, don't look either. Because seeing clearly would mean confronting their own role, would mean admitting they're running what amounts to a prostitution service disguised as medicine, would mean acknowledging they've built careers on a lie. Much easier to believe the medical theory. Much safer to maintain the fiction. The human capacity for self-deception, when survival seems to require it, is bottomless. Cracks were forming in the facade. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the structure was beginning to fail. The rise of psychoanalysis was part of it. Freud's theories about hysteria offered an alternative explanation. Hysteria wasn't caused by uterine dysfunction. It was caused by repressed psychological trauma, often sexual in nature. Freud didn't deny that pelvic massage provided symptom relief, but he argued it was treating symptoms, not causes. Real cure required addressing the underlying psychological issues through talk therapy. This was threatening to the medical establishment. If Freud was right, decades of treatment protocols were wrong. Thousands of physicians had been providing ineffective treatment, or worse, addressing a misunderstood condition with a procedure that was something else entirely. Medical journals published rebuttals. Defenders of traditional hysteria treatment argued that Freud's theories were speculative, unproven, and potentially harmful. They insisted that physical treatments for physical symptoms were sound medicine, but younger doctors, especially those interested in the emerging field of psychiatry, began to question. They read Freud, read the other psychoanalysts, and started to wonder if maybe hysteria was being misunderstood. Some began to reduce their use of pelvic massage, focusing instead on rest cures, dietary changes, environmental modifications. They still believed in hysteria as a diagnosis, but they sought different treatments. This didn't stop the practice. Too many doctors still relied on it. Too many patients still sought it. But doubt had entered the system. Social changes were accelerating too. The late Victorian period, especially the 1890s and early 1900s, saw significant shifts in women's lives. More women were getting education. More were working outside the home, at least before marriage. The suffrage movement was gaining strength. Women were beginning to question their restricted social roles. And quietly, very quietly, some were beginning to question the ideology of female passionlessness. It wasn't open rebellion. That would come later. But you can see it in the literature of the period. In novels, in women's private writings, in the cautious discussions in women's clubs and reform movements. Some women were starting to acknowledge, at least to each other, that the official story about female sexuality didn't match their lived experience. A letter from 1902 found in archives shows this shift. One woman writes to another about marriage and says, "I think perhaps we have been misled about what we should expect from conjugal relations. I have found that attentiveness from my husband to my own comfort makes the experience far more agreeable than I was taught to anticipate." The language is still careful, still euphemistic, but she's saying something radical. Women can enjoy sex. This isn't medical treatment or therapeutic crisis. This is pleasure, and it's acceptable to want it. These conversations were happening in private, among women who trusted each other. They weren't public, but they represented a crack in the ideological foundation that supported the hysteria construct. If women could want sex, could enjoy it, then the symptoms of hysteria looked less like mysterious illness and more like frustrated desire. And the treatment looked less like medicine and more like, well, the truth was becoming harder to avoid. As vibrators became cheaper and more widely available for home use, they spread beyond medical control. Women bought them from catalogs, they used them in private, they didn't need doctors anymore, and once that happened, the medical framing started to collapse. When women were dependent on physicians for treatment, the medical framing held the doctor's office. The professional manner, the clinical language, all of it reinforced the idea that this was medicine. But when women had vibrators at home, using them whenever they wanted, in their own bedrooms, the medical framing became harder to maintain. A woman using a device in privacy, regularly, because it makes her feel good, that's not medical treatment, that's personal pleasure. The catalogs still used medical language, the advertisements still talked about health and wellness. But everyone knew, the fig leaf was getting thinner. By the 1910s, vibrators were appearing in increasingly suggestive contexts. Advertisements showed women using them with expressions that were, let's say, ambiguous. The copy still mentioned health benefits, but it also talked about thrilling sensations and intimate wellness in ways that made the sexual nature barely deniable. And then came the pornography. The appearance of vibrators in stag films in the 1920s was the death blow to the medical fiction. Stag films were short, silent, pornographic movies shown at private gatherings. They were illegal, underground, explicitly sexual, and in the 1920s they started featuring vibrators. The films showed women using vibrators for obvious sexual pleasure. No medical context, no therapeutic justification. Just straightforward depiction of vibrators as sex toys. Once that happened, physicians couldn't maintain plausible deniability anymore. You can't argue that a device is purely medical when it's appearing in pornography. You can't claim the response it produces is therapeutic when films are showing women obviously experiencing sexual climax from it. The pretense finally became unsustainable. Through the 1920s, medical use of vibrators for hysteria treatment quietly disappeared. Doctors stopped offering it. Medical schools stopped teaching it. The practice that had been mainstream for decades simply evaporated. It wasn't banned. No medical organization issued a statement condemning it. It just became impossible to maintain the pretense, so practitioners abandoned it. The vibrator industry pivoted hard. Devices that had been marketed as medical tools were rebranded as massage devices for sore muscles. Advertisements showed people using them on their backs, shoulders, feet, anywhere except the pelvic region. The sexual connotation was now so strong that manufacturers had to distance their products from it, which is almost funny. The devices had always been for sexual use, but now that everyone admitted it, they had to pretend they weren't. The pretense inverted. Instead of sexual devices pretending to be medical, they became medical devices trying to hide their sexual history. The diagnosis of hysteria took longer to die, but die it did. Through the 1930s and 1940s, hysteria persisted as a diagnosis, but it fragmented. What had been one catch-all condition split into multiple distinct disorders: anxiety, depression, conversion disorder, somatization. Psychoanalysis provided new constructs for understanding these conditions. Women's symptoms were reinterpreted as psychological rather than physiological. The treatments shifted to talk therapy, medication, environmental changes. The uterus was no longer blamed for women's mental and emotional distress. This was progress, sort of. Women's psychological experiences were being taken more seriously. But notice what persisted. The assumption that women's emotional and sexual lives were complicated, problematic, requiring expert intervention. The specific diagnosis changed, the theoretical approach changed, but the fundamental pattern remained. Women still went to mostly male doctors for help with distress that often stemmed from restrictive social roles and unfulfilling relationships. The doctors still prescribed treatments. The medicalization of women's experiences continued, just in different forms. In 1952, the American Psychiatric Association removed Hysteria from the first edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. After centuries as medicine's most common diagnosis, hysteria officially ceased to exist. Except, of course, the underlying issues never went away. Women still experienced sexual frustration, still faced social restrictions, still internalized messages that their sexuality was problematic. The medical approach for addressing this just became more sophisticated, more psychological, less overtly absurd. Now to 1955, post-war America. The suburbs are booming. Women who worked during the war are back in the home. The feminine mystique is in full effect. Betty Friedan won't publish her book for another 8 years, but the discontent she'll describe is already simmering. Women who are educated, capable, confined to domestic roles, told they should be fulfilled by housework and child-rearing, feeling vaguely unsatisfied. Some of these women go to doctors. They describe symptoms, anxiety, depression, unexplained physical complaints. The doctors prescribe mother's little helpers, Miltown, Valium, other tranquilizers. The pattern is familiar, isn't it? Women experience distress from restrictive social roles. Medicine provides something that addresses symptoms without challenging the social structure causing the distress. In the Victorian era, it was pelvic massage for hysteria. In the 1950s, it's tranquilizers for suburban housewife syndrome. Different treatment, same dynamic, and sexuality is still being medicalized. The 1950s see the rise of marriage manuals written by doctors, explaining proper sexual technique to newlyweds. These books reveal persistent assumptions about female sexuality. Women are described as more complex than men sexually. They require more careful stimulation. They need the right psychological conditions. Their orgasms are more difficult to achieve, more mysterious, more problematic. Male sexuality is simple, straightforward, natural. Female sexuality is complicated, requiring expert guidance. The Kinsey reports challenged some of these assumptions, documenting that women had strong sexual drives and were capable of multiple orgasms. But watch how this information was received. Instead of simplifying the picture of female sexuality, it was used to create new anxieties. Now women were supposed to be orgasmic, but only in the right ways. Orgasms from clitoral stimulation were immature. Real, adult female sexuality meant vaginal orgasms from penetration. Freud had declared this decades earlier, and it became medical orthodoxy. Women who couldn't achieve vaginal orgasms, which is most women. The vibrator, interestingly, mostly disappeared from public discourse during this period. It was too associated with female sexual autonomy, too reminiscent of its Victorian medical past. Women who wanted them had to seek them out in specific shops or through discreet mail order. The sexual revolution of the 1960s would change this again, but for now in the 1950s, female sexuality was still being constrained, pathologized, and medicalized, just through different mechanisms than the Victorians used. From the 1850s through the 1950s, a full century, medical science consistently treated female sexuality as a problem requiring expert, usually male, intervention. The specifics changed. The diagnoses changed. The treatments changed. But the fundamental dynamic remained constant. Women's sexual needs weren't acknowledged as normal, healthy, or simple. They were mysterious, complicated, medical issues. Women couldn't be trusted to understand or address their own sexuality. They needed doctors to diagnose them, treat them, tell them what was wrong and how to fix it. Male sexuality, meanwhile, was treated as straightforward. Men had drives, needed release, and this was natural and uncomplicated. This double standard wasn't just about morality, it was woven into medical science, into professional practice. This wasn't a conspiracy. These were well-meaning doctors, operating within constructs they genuinely believed. They thought they were helping women, thought they were applying scientific knowledge to medical problems. The ideology was so pervasive, so taken for granted, that they couldn't see the absurdity. Just like Victorian doctors couldn't see that pelvic massage was simply masturbation. Just like they couldn't see that hysteria was sexual frustration. Just like they performed thousands of these treatments without ever acknowledging what they were doing. The feminist movements of the 1960s and 70s began to challenge these patterns directly. The Boston Women's Health Book Collective published Our Bodies, Ourselves in 1970. It was revolutionary because it treated female sexuality as normal, healthy, and uncomplicated. It encouraged women to explore their own bodies, understand their own pleasure, advocate for their own needs. No medical intermediary needed, no expert diagnosis required, just straightforward information about how bodies work and what feels good. This was radical. It positioned women as authorities on their own sexual experiences. It rejected the medicalization approach entirely. The book included accurate information about the clitoris, about orgasm, about masturbation. It acknowledged that most women don't orgasm from penetration alone. It said women could use vibrators or their own hands or whatever else worked for them to experience pleasure. This should have been obvious, uncontroversial information. But in 1970, it was shocking, because it contradicted decades of medical and social messaging that women's sexuality was complicated, mysterious, problematic. The response from mainstream medicine was initially dismissive. Some doctors criticized the book as unscientific, irresponsible, potentially harmful to women's psychological health. They were defending the medicalization approach, defending their role as experts, defending the idea that women needed professional guidance for something as basic as understanding their own bodies. But the book succeeded anyway. It sold millions of copies. Women read it, shared it, used it to understand themselves better. They took ownership of their sexuality in ways previous generations couldn't, and this began to shift the broader culture. Slowly, very slowly, but the shift was real. By the 1970s, vibrators came out of the shadows again. Feminist sex-positive shops like Good Vibrations in San Francisco began selling them openly as tools for female sexual pleasure. No medical pretense, no therapeutic justification, just honest acknowledgement. These are devices that provide sexual pleasure, and that's fine. This was revolutionary because it rejected the entire construct that had surrounded vibrators since their invention. They weren't medical devices, they weren't therapeutic tools. They were sex toys, and women had every right to use them. The language shift alone was significant. Sex toy instead of medical device, pleasure instead of therapy, sexual wellness instead of hysteria treatment. Words matter. The Victorian era used medical language to disguise sexual reality. The feminist sex-positive movement used sexual language to acknowledge sexual reality. This honesty was liberating for many women. It allowed them to approach their sexuality without shame, without needing to justify pleasure as medicine. But it was also threatening to the established order. Sex-positive feminism faced backlash from conservatives who thought it was corrupting women's morality, and from some other feminists who thought it was playing into male objectification. The debates were intense, but what emerged was an approach that centered women's autonomy, the right to make their own choices about their bodies and sexuality, without medical or moral gatekeeping. This was progress, real, meaningful progress. But notice how long it took. Vibrators were invented in the 1880s. Women began openly claiming the right to use them for pleasure in the 1970s. That's nearly a century of pretense, medicalization, and mental gymnastics before society could just acknowledge reality. Nearly 100 years to get from therapeutic device for treating hysteria to sex toy for pleasure. That's how deep the resistance to acknowledging female sexuality ran. Even now, in the 21st century, the legacy persists in ways you might not immediately recognize. Walk into any drugstore, go to the personal care aisle. You'll find vibrators, but they're still often marketed as personal massagers. The packaging is clinical, medical-looking. Pastel colors, soft focus photography, euphemistic language about wellness and self-care. Everyone knows what these devices are for. The pretense isn't fooling anyone, but the pretense persists. Why? Because we're still uncomfortable with the directness of female sexual pleasure. We can acknowledge it now, sure. We've made progress. But there's still enough discomfort that manufacturers hedge with medical-adjacent marketing. Still enough residual shame that many women feel more comfortable buying something labeled a massager than something labeled a sex toy. The Victorian construct isn't gone. It's just softer, more subtle, easier to ignore. But it's there. Consider how we still talk about female sexuality in medical and popular contexts. Female sexual dysfunction is a recognized medical category. There are diagnoses: hypoactive sexual desire disorder, female orgasmic disorder, genitopelvic pain penetration disorder. There are treatments, medications, therapy, medical devices. Some of this is legitimate medicine, addressing real problems. Sexual pain is real. Trauma affects sexual response. Medical conditions can impact desire and function. But look at the broader pattern. Female sexuality is still treated as inherently more complicated, more fragile, more prone to dysfunction than male sexuality. Women who don't want sex frequently enough, that's a disorder. Women who can't orgasm from penetration, that's a dysfunction. Women who prefer different types of stimulation than their partners provide, that's a problem requiring intervention. Meanwhile, male sexuality is still generally treated as straightforward. Men want sex, men have erections, Men orgasm. Simple, natural, uncomplicated. When men have sexual problems, erectile dysfunction, premature ejaculation, those are treated as mechanical issues with mechanical solutions. Take a pill, problem solved. When women have sexual problems, the approach is more complex. It's about desire, arousal, psychological factors, relationship dynamics. Again, some of this is good medicine. Sexuality does have psychological and relational components that matter, but the asymmetry is telling. The underlying assumption is still that male sexuality is simple and female sexuality is complicated, that men's sexual needs are straightforward and women's require expert interpretation. The Victorian doctors who thought women's sexual response was mysterious and required medical management, their descendants are still practicing, just with better theories and less absurd treatments. Modern sex research consistently shows that in heterosexual encounters, particularly casual ones, women orgasm far less frequently than men. The numbers vary by study, but a typical finding: men orgasm about 95% of the time during partnered sex, women orgasm about 65% of the time in relationships, and far less, sometimes as low as 11%, in casual encounters. This gap narrows in same-sex encounters. Lesbian women report orgasm rates similar to or higher than heterosexual men. What does this tell us? It tells us that women's orgasms aren't inherently more difficult or complicated. They're difficult in contexts where partners don't know or don't prioritize what actually works for women's bodies. Most women don't orgasm from penetration alone. They need clitoral stimulation. This is basic anatomy, well documented since the 1960s. Yet the cultural script for sex still centers penetration. Sex means intercourse. Everything else is foreplay. The main event is the part that reliably produces male orgasm but not female orgasm. This is the Victorian legacy, still operating. The assumption that male pleasure is central and female pleasure is supplementary. That male orgasm is the natural conclusion of sex, and female orgasm is, nice if it happens, but optional. Women who don't orgasm from this script often internalize it as their own failure. They're broken, dysfunctional. They need to relax more, be more present. Sound familiar? Victorian women with symptoms of sexual frustration were told they had hysteria. Modern women who don't orgasm from sex scripts designed around male pleasure are told they have arousal disorders. Different language, same dynamic. The problem is located in women's bodies rather than in social scripts that don't serve women's pleasure. I want to be careful here. I'm not saying modern sex therapy is equivalent to Victorian hysteria treatment. It's not. Modern sexology is evidence-based, ethical, genuinely helpful for many people. But the broader pattern, the medicalization of female sexuality, the assumption that women's sexual experiences are inherently problematic, that pattern persists, and it has consequences. Women learn to see their sexuality through a medical lens. They pathologize normal variations in desire. They worry that their preferences are dysfunctional. They seek expert solutions for problems that might not be problems at all, but just mismatches between their needs and social expectations. A woman who doesn't want frequent sex might not have hypoactive sexual desire disorder. She might just be tired, stressed, or in a relationship where sex isn't that enjoyable for her. But the medical construct offers a diagnosis, which implies something is wrong with her rather than with her circumstances. A woman who doesn't orgasm from penetration doesn't have female orgasmic disorder. She has normal anatomy. But if she's internalized the expectation that she should orgasm from penetration, she might seek medical help for being normal. The Victorian doctors medicalized women's sexual frustration as hysteria. We've gotten more sophisticated, but we're still medicalizing women's sexual experiences in ways we don't do for men. Catherine, our Victorian patient, experienced this in extreme form. She had sexual needs. Victorian society said respectable women didn't have such needs, so her needs became symptoms. Her symptoms became disease. Her disease required treatment. The treatment provided what she needed while maintaining the fiction that she didn't need it. The system was absurd, but it was functional absurdity. It solved a real problem while preserving an ideological commitment. Modern women face a softer version of the same dynamic. They have sexual needs and preferences. Social scripts often don't accommodate those needs, so needs become dysfunctions. Dysfunctions require treatment. Treatment addresses symptoms without necessarily changing the scripts. A woman who isn't orgasming with her partner gets therapy to help her relax and be more present during sex. This might help. But it's locating the problem in her psychology, rather than asking whether her partner knows what he's doing or cares about her pleasure. A woman with low desire gets medication to increase her libido. This might help. But it's medicating her response to a situation rather than examining whether the situation itself is the problem. Again, I'm not saying therapy and medication are never appropriate. Sometimes they are. Sometimes individual psychology genuinely is the issue. But the pattern of medicalizing women's sexual dissatisfaction while leaving social structures unexamined, that's Victorian logic operating in modern form. The vibrator's history illuminates this perfectly. It was invented to solve a problem created by ideology. Victorian doctors needed to address women's sexual frustration without acknowledging female sexuality. Manual stimulation worked but was time-consuming. So technology stepped in. The vibrator could provide what women needed more efficiently than human hands. It was marketed and sold within a medical construct that disguised its true function. Thousands of women used vibrators while maintaining the fiction that they were medical devices. Then society shifted enough to acknowledge female sexuality. The medical construct collapsed. Vibrators became sex toys. But even now, they're often marketed with medical-adjacent language, because direct acknowledgement of female sexual pleasure still carries discomfort. The vibrator never changed. What changed was the story we told about it. And that story changed slowly, reluctantly, incompletely. A technology that's been providing women with orgasms for 140 years still can't be marketed straightforwardly in mainstream contexts. We still need the fig leaf of personal massager and wellness device. This reveals our residual Victorian attitudes more clearly than any explicit discussion of morality would. We say we've moved beyond repression. We say female sexuality is acknowledged and accepted. But our marketing language, our product placement, our continued discomfort with directness, it all says otherwise. The ideology hasn't disappeared. It's just gone underground, operating through implication and euphemism rather than explicit doctrine. A woman in her 30s described buying her first vibrator. She went to a drugstore, found them in the personal care section next to heating pads and back massagers. She stood in the aisle for 10 minutes, afraid someone would see her, debating whether to buy it. Finally, she grabbed one and went to the checkout. The cashier, a young man, didn't react at all, just scanned it like any other item. She got home, tried it, had an intense orgasm within minutes. And then she cried. Not from shame or guilt, from anger. She was 34 years old. She'd been sexually active for 16 years, and this was the first time she'd experienced that kind of pleasure. All those years, it had been available this easily, a device she could buy at a drugstore, use in private, reliable and effective. But nobody had told her. Not her sex education classes, which focused on reproduction and STI prevention. Not her women's magazines, which talked about pleasing men and complicated emotional preparation. Not her doctors during routine checkups. The information was technically available. She could have figured it out. But the silence around it, the euphemistic marketing, the cultural squeamishness about female masturbation, all of it created a barrier. She felt like she'd been lied to, like 16 years of mediocre sex and frustration had been unnecessary. And she was right. This is the Victorian legacy operating now, not through explicit repression, but through silence, euphemism, and discomfort. Victorian doctors were men treating women. They held institutional authority, professional expertise, and social power. Women came to them as patients, in a subordinate role. The hysteria treatment involved male doctors touching women's genitals until they orgasmed. The power differential made this problematic in ways that go beyond just the medical fraud of the diagnosis. These were encounters between powerful and powerless parties, where the powerful party provided intimate touch while maintaining the fiction that it wasn't sexual. The potential for abuse was enormous, and abuse certainly happened, though it's difficult to document because women had no construct for complaining. If a doctor behaved inappropriately during hysteria treatment, what did that even mean when the treatment itself involved genital stimulation? How would a woman articulate that the treatment felt wrong when she wasn't supposed to acknowledge it as sexual in the first place? The structure protected doctors and silenced patients. Women who had bad experiences had no recourse, no language to describe what happened, no authority to challenge medical expertise. Some women surely benefited from the treatment despite its fraudulent basis. They got relief they needed. The doctors were professional. The encounters were as ethical as they could be given the absurd construct. But some women surely had experiences that were violating, traumatic, abusive. Doctors who took advantage of the situation, who enjoyed the power, who crossed lines that shouldn't have been crossed. And those women had no voice, no way to name what happened to them. The Victorian records don't include those stories. We can only infer they must have existed. This isn't just historical concern. The power dynamics in medical encounters around sexuality remain complicated. Even now, with better ethics oversight and clearer professional boundaries, the medical exam of women's bodies involves vulnerability and power differential. Women still sometimes report feeling violated during gynecological exams, still experience dismissal of their concerns, disbelief of their pain, minimization of their experiences. The medical profession has gotten better about this. Training now includes more emphasis on patient autonomy, informed consent, trauma-informed care, but problems persist, and the fundamental dynamic, expert male authority over female bodies and sexuality, that's still common. Most gynecologists are still men. Most sex therapists treating women's sexual dysfunction are still operating within constructs largely developed by men. Progress has been real, but the Victorian pattern of male medical authority managing female sexuality hasn't been completely dismantled. Women's reproductive and sexual health care still involves navigating systems that weren't designed with their full autonomy and authority in mind. Catherine lived into the 1920s. Imagine her in 1925, in her 70s now. The world has changed dramatically. Women have the vote in Britain and America. Hemlines are shorter. Young women are smoking, drinking, going to jazz clubs unchaperoned. There's open discussion of sexuality in ways that would have been scandalous in Catherine's youth. She reads about the new psychology, the new freedom. She hears younger women talk about pleasure and desire without shame. She sees advertisements for products that are barely disguised in their sexual purpose. And maybe in private moments she thinks about those weekly visits to Dr. Waverley decades ago. The treatment that helped her so much. The relief she felt. Does she understand now what was really happening? Or has she maintained the construct all these years, still thinking of it as medical treatment for a legitimate condition? I suspect it varies. Some women in her position probably gained clarity as society changed. They looked back and saw the truth. They felt anger or embarrassment, or perhaps just bemusement at the charade. Others probably maintained the fiction until they died. Too psychologically costly to reframe all those years. Better to keep believing it was medicine. Both responses are understandable. Both are very human. Catherine might sit in her parlour, reading a magazine, seeing an advertisement for beauty products that mentions vibrating massage for radiant skin. She might smile slightly, recognizing the euphemism, or she might take it at face value, seeing no connection to her own past. We can't know. The historical record doesn't preserve the internal experiences of women navigating this transition, but we can imagine her there, a Victorian woman in the Jazz Age, carrying in her body and memory an experience that society first medicalized, then denied, then slowly began to acknowledge. She represents millions of women who lived through that transition, who experienced their sexuality through constructs that were simultaneously repressive and permissive, denying and addressing, truthful and false. Their experiences shaped the world we inherited. Their silence enabled the system. Their participation maintained it. Their eventual clarity helped dismantle it. They deserve to be remembered not with judgment but with understanding. They were doing their best in an impossible situation. As you settle toward sleep tonight, let the strangeness of this story wash over you. Victorian doctors, respectable and professional, giving women orgasms in medical offices while both parties pretended it was disease treatment. The vibrator, invented to make this practice more efficient, marketed as medical equipment, spreading into homes under therapeutic pretense. Thousands of women receiving sexual release while maintaining absolute conviction that they weren't experiencing anything sexual. An entire society organizing itself around a fiction that everyone knew was false but nobody could acknowledge. It happened. It's documented. It's real. So what can we take from this strange history? Be suspicious of systems that seem designed to avoid acknowledging simple truths. When explanations become baroque, when justifications multiply, when everyone agrees not to say the obvious thing, that's usually a sign that ideology is overriding reality. Recognize that beneficial systems can still be fundamentally dishonest. The hysteria treatment worked in the sense that it relieved symptoms, but it worked while maintaining a harmful fiction. Success at one level doesn't justify problems at another level. Understand that power imbalances distort reality. When one group has authority over another, absurdities can persist because the powerless can't effectively challenge the powerful. The Victorian gender hierarchy enabled medical fraud for decades. Be patient with people trapped in ideological constructs they can't see past. Victorian women weren't weak or stupid. They were products of their time, doing their best with available constructs. Judging them accomplishes nothing. Understanding them teaches us about human limitation and possibility. Recognize that progress happens slowly and incompletely. We've moved beyond Victorian repression in many ways. but we're still carrying some of the same patterns. Acknowledging progress doesn't mean declaring victory. Stay alert to your own blind spots. We're participating in systems now that future generations will find absurd. We can't see them clearly because we're inside them, but knowing they exist should make us more humble, more questioning. The Victorian doctors giving women orgasms while calling it hysteria treatment. They're us, we're them, different topics, same human limitations. Humility in the face of that is wisdom. Despite everything, the repression, the medicalization, the denial, the systems of control, people's actual desires and needs persisted. Victorian women needed sexual release. Society said they couldn't need it. Medicine created a construct to provide it while denying it. Women participated in this construct because it was the best option available. But underneath all the theatre, the actual human need remained constant. You can't actually eliminate sexuality through ideology. You can only channel it, disguise it, medicalize it, complicate it. The fundamental reality persists beneath whatever stories we tell about it. This is oddly hopeful. It means that human nature has a certain robustness, that our bodies and desires continue existing even when our ideologies deny them. That truth has a way of persisting even under layers of fiction. The Victorian repression was severe, comprehensive, backed by every institution, and yet women still found ways to get their needs met, even if those ways were absurd and dishonest. The vibrator exists because female sexuality was powerful enough to create demand despite complete ideological denial. The device had to be invented, had to be marketed, had to spread into homes because the need was real and persistent. Ideology shapes reality, but doesn't fully determine it. Human needs find expression, even through tremendous constraint. This doesn't excuse the constraint. The Victorian system caused real suffering, real harm. Women deserved better than having to seek medical treatment for normal sexuality, but it suggests a kind of resilience, a resistance of human nature to complete social construction. We're not infinitely malleable. We're not blank slates for ideology to write on. We have bodies, needs, desires that persist despite what we're taught to believe about them. The Victorian experiment in female sexual repression ultimately failed. It took a century, but it failed. Reality asserted itself. This is worth remembering when facing other forms of repression, other denials of human nature, other attempts to make ideology override obvious truth. Eventually, reality wins, not quickly, not easily, not without cost, but eventually, the vibrator still exists, still provides the same function it always has, still helps women experience pleasure, but now, finally, we can mostly be honest about what it does and why it matters. That honesty took 140 years to achieve, and even now it's incomplete, but it's progress. Real, hard-won, valuable progress. Rest well tonight, grateful for that progress, while remaining humble about how much we still can't see. The story of Victorian hysteria is strange and uncomfortable, and absolutely true. It reveals us to ourselves, our capacity for self-deception, our resistance to truth, our eventual ability to see clearly. We're capable of remarkable absurdity, and we're capable of eventually recognizing it. Both capacities define us. Sleep well,